And Officer Gore takes his revolver out and he points it at the vehicle and he starts issuing commands from the front left fender of the CHP vehicle. And Gore is ordering the felons to come out of the vehicle with their hands up. They're not complying. We've got a lot of things that are going on here in a very short time frame that send up a lot of warning flags to us now in retrospect. But it appears that our officers, as young as they were, may not have seen some of these signs and they may not have recognized them for their importance. And so they proceeded to make contact with the suspects. As he opens the door, the passenger throws the door open, and the passenger who is twining, he fires 2 rounds from a .357 Magnum revolver and shoots and kills Officer Frago instantly. Throughout the course of this fight, every time the felons would run dry with their weapons, they would simply fetch another loaded one out of the car. There's a third storyline that runs through this, which is interesting. The storyline is that there's a citizen that's driving to work, and his name is Gary Kness. Gary's a former Marine with combat experience in Korea, and he sees the second CHP cruiser containing Allen and Pence drive past him as they exit the Henry Mayo Drive and drive up the old road into the service station. And Gary's driving on that way because he's going to work. And Gary follows the CHP cruiser loosely up past the service station, and he sees this gunfight playing out. And Gary would tell us later that he thought at first it was some kind of movie being filmed. He didn't think it was a real incident. But he realized pretty quickly that this was a real gunfight that was happening. And he sees Officer Allen go down from Davis's attack with a shotgun. And Gary decides that he's going to try to help rescue Officer Allen.
Hello, America. This is your Leo Nation, where we believe in and support the rule of law. I am the Chief, Mark Garrett. I'd like to welcome you back to part 2 of this tremendous episode of the Newhall shooting, a tactical analysis with our special guest, Mike Wood, the author of that book. Also joining us is Bill Bodner, retired special agent in charge of the DEA Los Angeles field office. Gentlemen, welcome back to part 2, and let's get started. Before we get started, if you have not seen part 1 of this podcast, of this particular episode, you must go back and watch part 1 to fully appreciate what's coming up in part 2. It's a tremendous look and really introspection on law enforcement tactics, training, history, and culture. So with that said, let's get started, and thank you for watching.
So, Mike, I have a question,
Sure.
and I don't know if maybe more appropriate for Mark, just about the mindset going in. Because, Mark, I feel like at the beginning you made it sound like, hey, this was a misdemeanor crime at the time, right? Brandishing a firearm was a misdemeanor crime. Probably not uncommon for this area to have someone brandish a firearm. The one officer had been on a similar call a short time before this. But yet am I correct that it sounds like they had put a plan together to do a 2-car stop, right? So in their mind, I mean, was their intention to do what would have been the equivalent of a felony stop in 1970? Because it seems like that to me. So I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of a contradiction there as we talk about the mindset.
I'm glad you picked up on it because that's one of the things that I discuss in the book. There is this dichotomy between their actions and just even between partners. For example, Gore and Frago were both running different playbooks. When Frago stepped up to the right front corner of the CHP cruiser, he was actually following the tactics they had been taught for a routine stop. But Gore, the driver, was actually running the playbook that they would use for what they considered to be a hot stop, today's terminology, a felony stop. And so between the two partners, there was obviously a lack of coordination and communication there, where it seemed like they were running different plays. And so that's one of the themes that kind of runs throughout this shooting, that there's there's mental confusion there amongst the officers where it's not clear that they understood how they want to approach this stop and which tactics that they wanted to use to do it. Like you said, this is relatively common in everything in the area, is what the CHP tells us afterwards as part of an explanation to their mindset. Yet they were planning to do a 4-officer stop of these guys, and they did pull out weapons right away, and at least one of the officers was running hot stop tactics. And so that's one of the things that's difficult to wrestle with how this played out.
That's a good observation, Bill, and Mike does do a great job of talking about that in the book. And we can touch on this a little bit, Mike. I wonder if some of that, like you said, the dichotomy, the maybe lack of communication or coordination, how they approach this. By the way, I want to say this. Another thing you do great in the book is you write an entire passage about being careful to condemn the officers with their actions, because they wrote what I learned in their blood, and I wasn't there. The only 4 officers that we're talking about lost their lives that night. Very, very respectful. It's not a criticism. It's just, what can we learn from what happened that night? So having said that, do you think that this one point that Bill brought up, does that possibly have to do with their relative inexperience? These are 2 very new officers. In other words, there wasn't a lot of repetition in the real world.
One of the things that I do by virtue of my background as a military officer and military pilot is that, when we take a look at when things go wrong, we start trying to take a look at what are the fundamental causes of why people do what they do. And it's usually related to things like training and agency culture and things like that, and conditioning. And if we take a look at these officers, it would be easy to lay blame for the errors that they made, the tactical errors that they made during this fight, on the fact that they were young. And they were all very young. I think the most experienced officer, if I remember right, only had about 20 months worth of experience on the highway patrol at the time. I think 2 of the officers were 12-month veterans of the highway patrol. So they were very young and they were very inexperienced. But we also have to look at the training that they received as well. And the highway patrol of the era was in a race to try to double its size within the course of a 3-year period. The state was growing, the interstates were growing. We had a law and order governor, Ronald Reagan, that had been elected on a law and order campaign. And part of his campaign promise was to double the size of the highway patrol from roughly about 3,000 officers to more than 6,000 officers in the course of 3 years. And so what happened internally at the highway patrol is that the training machine was running in high gear, and they were trying to pump as many officers as they could through the academy as quickly as they could. And what was also happening is that when these young officers came out of the academy and they got to their first assignment at their first area office, they were now under the instruction of a field training officer that might just barely be in front of them on the seniority list. Many of these officers.
And Mike, was that a 10-week, or Mark, was that a 10-week program at the time?
16 weeks.
16
weeks. Yeah, just short of 900 hours in 16 weeks. It was a live-in academy, and by today's standards, that doesn't sound like a whole lot. I think today's CHP Academy, Mark, you can correct me, I think it's well over 24 weeks.
It's 27 weeks, if I remember correctly now.
Yeah. So it's the depth of material and instruction that an officer receives today is much greater than what these officers had. But for the time, it was actually a very robust and very strong training experience. I mean, this is a time in law enforcement, even in a progressive state like California, where a lot of officers never went to a formal academy. They just reported for work and they learned on the job. And so
Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what about the field? What I was getting at was the field training portion. Once they're out of the academy, how long at that time was the formal field training program?
An amazingly fast 30 days.
30 days.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a lot different now. Now it's about 4 months, which is still kind of industry standard. And other agencies are a lot longer than that, but it's about 4 months, give or take, for the Highway Patrol, depending on the trainee.
Yeah. Yeah, these officers had a 30-day FTO period, and again, they were being taught by FTOs that may just have a couple more months worth of experience than they did,
Right.
because the agency was so young as a whole. And particularly if you go to a junior station like Newhall, I mean, Newhall was not a plum assignment for highway patrolmen of the period, and so you tended to get junior officers that were stationed there, and so you didn't have a whole lot of seasoned veterans that were just hanging around waiting to show the young kids the ropes in a place like Newhall. Lots of times it was younger officers that were just barely ahead of the new recruits coming in the door. And so our officers at Newhall this night were young, they were inexperienced, they were the product of a training machine that, by the standards of the day, was good. But if we look at it today under different standards, we realize just how little training they got. Um, the the if we talk about what the Highway Patrol calls enforcement tactics, which is essentially the science of how to do a felony car stop, uh, the officers of the day were getting, depending on the era, anywhere from about 20 to 30 hours of classroom training in how to conduct these high risk stops, and they were getting a 6 hour field exercise practice on how to actually execute these stops. So 20 to 30 hours of classroom work and then 6 hours of practical hands-on scenario work and how to do this stuff. And that was all the training that they got in how to do these things. And then they were kicked out to the field and expected to be able to do it. Similarly, arrest and control stuff, physical methods of arrest training was very curtailed in the academy environment. They got about as much training on the history of government in California and California geography and photography and report writing as they did on anything to deal with arrest and control, searching, and so forth. So their training was very lopsided towards more administrative topics, and so they had very little training on the hard skills, if you will. And that, combined with their inexperience this night, I think were definite contributors to the decisions that they made and the way that things played out at this gunfight.
And do you guys know, at that time, was it common to work with the same partner for a longer period of time, or?
Yeah, you'd get assigned a shift with a beat partner and work that with them, usually for a quarter, and then the rotation could change again.
Yeah, and this is to that point about the really the junior FTOs or field training officers. And even when I broke in 1991, really, and by the way, it was a partner area to Newhall, Altadena. So my area where I patrolled, we bordered Newhall, which is one of the reasons that I know it so well. But one of the things was they would tell the new guys, don't partner up with your classmate. Don't do it. There were 5 of us out of the academy that went to Altadena. Back then it was called Verdugo Hills. Before that it was called Glendale when it abutted Newhall. But they would tell you, don't partner with your academy classmate if you can avoid it. So what did I do for 3 years? I rode with my academy classmate. But you're comfortable with people that and you go down there, you're kind of the odd guy out with all these senior officers. But the senior officers knew, and by the way, not a lot of senior officers wanted to ride with the junior guys, but at the same time they tell you, when you're working graveyards, try to get a senior guy or gal to ride with. And that's something that did not happen here for maybe a number of reasons, but here we are. Mike, I want to ask you about, there's so many things, and I know there's some things that you specifically want to talk to, so we'll make sure that we get to those. The location of the stop, we talked about this in the previous episode, that the officers did not dictate where this enforcement contact took place. And one of the things, there are two things aspect about this. You talked about there's a ditch on either side of the driveway, not allowing the officers to really vacate those tight premises where the patrol car was. The 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 criminals, the perpetrators, they pulled into this location, to this coffee shop / service station. One of the things that you made so clear had never occurred to me all my years in highway patrol. They pulled into this very, very well lit location. And so immediately, by no fault of the officers, it took the advantage of the spotlights away. The perpetrators theoretically could see the officers as well as the officers could see them. And I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit, maybe talk about your experience writing this book and conversations about what officers learned about where they make a traffic stop.
Well, again, from the military perspective, you always want to have your opponent reacting to you. You want to have the initiative in any confrontation, and you want them to be reactive to your moves, not vice versa. And so, unfortunately, the way this played out from the very beginning, our officers were having to react to the plan that had been laid down by the bad guys. And I think one of the important lessons that the Highway Patrol took from this, and that I'd hope that today's officers would take from it, is that we really want you to dictate the conditions as much as possible when you have these contacts with suspects, so that you can maximize your advantages and minimize your disadvantages. And so this is a scenario where when that Pontiac stopped in the driveway, how could things have worked out differently for our officers if they had simply got on the PA and said, "Driver, pull your vehicle forward and park over by the #1 gas station pump," or something like that? If they had changed the terrain that this battle was going to be fought on and put themselves in a greater position of advantage from the very start, might that have short-circuited the bad guys' plans to try to take them on? And it's possible. At the very least, it might have left them in a better position to be able to fight their fight from. So, there are times when you can control the pacing and the tempo and the layout of the battlefield. And when you have that ability, you need to do that. Now, obviously, the bad guys get a vote. And there are times when they are going to control the pacing and the tempo in the battlefield because of when they choose to do certain things. And there's not much that you can do about that. But very early in the stop, while the suspects still hadn't shown any type of non-compliance yet, there was an opportunity there for our officers to order them to go someplace else so that it was a more advantageous position for them. And they didn't do it. And so that's an important lesson for our officers to take away from that.
It is. It's a very important lesson. And again, I was a new officer, so I'm speaking from that perspective. This is not about these 4 officers. It's about me. And I remember the number of times that I went home at night and I thought, man, I'm just pure lucky that I wasn't killed by that person because I screwed up. And a lot of the times that you screw up on tactics, especially being a new officer, there's that adrenaline pumping. There's not a lot of experience. And one of the things that takes time to learn, even if it's pounded into your head in the academy or from an FTO, is patience. You don't have to do everything this second, and you need to control the environment. And these are hard lessons to learn, and some harder ways than others that we're talking about right now. But I think about the times that I was hasty just to get in control of the situation and get the stop done or the enforcement contact, whatever it is. But time, usually, not every second we get that, but every time. But time is often on your side, and when it is, take advantage of that opportunity. Is my takeaway from my experience and the mistakes that I made that, thank God, did not cost me my life.
Yeah, I mean, just think about if our first set of officers, if Gore and Frago had simply waited a minute, they would have had their backup partners there with a second vehicle. We could have had a much better advantage of personnel 4-on-2. We could have had a much better tactical layout, and it just could have gone so much differently had they waited just that extra minute and elected not to go ahead and walk up to the car and initiate pulling the suspects out. So that was a big takeaway for the Highway Patrol, and something that they emphasized to their officers following this event is that you need to take advantage of time. When you have control of the clock, then you need to take advantage of that time to come up with a good tactical plan and get the help that you need, and not try to tackle too much by yourself.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And again, I'm speaking from experience.
Yeah.
And it's the other thing, we talked about this in the previous episode, and I'd like to get a little more into the tactical aspect of this, which is why we're doing the second episode about the tactical perspective and training and equipment. The officer Frago, I believe it was Frago, who made the right side approach with a shotgun.
Right.
Correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
On the initial unit. What's that? 78-8, I believe, was the first car.
Correct.
Yeah.
And 78-12 was for the second.
And he made the approach. So, in other words, again, this is down the road. We learn from this. We start bringing the suspects back to the patrol cars now, back to the vehicles. But in that case, when he walked up to the vehicle, an occupied vehicle, he knows it's occupied, and he has a shotgun, or eventually places the shotgun kind of at port arms, resting the butt on the hip. And again, my memory is bad, so I apologize. I don't remember in the book. In other words, was there anything that you remember from your research that actually prohibited him from that actual movement, that choice, or was that something that he did violate? So, as far as training,
the Highway Patrol at the time taught essentially two basic methods for contacting people in a vehicle. The first was for a routine stop where we didn't have any suspicion of a high threat or anything like that. And in that case, partner officers, the way that they were encouraged to work it is they were encouraged to have the passenger officer maintain an overwatch position at the CHP car, and then the driver officer would go forward and make contact with the drivers and the suspects and passengers in the car. And it was relatively fluid. The passenger officer could also approach the car as well and make contact. But for a hot stop, for a threat level where you believe that there was some type of danger that was posed by the people in the vehicle, the procedure that the Highway Patrol taught was for the passenger officer, if one was present, to take the shotgun and take a position from behind the open passenger side door, aim the shotgun at the vehicle, and your job was to provide overwatch, to provide cover, and the suspects would be ordered out of the car. And when the suspects were ordered out of the car, then the driver officer would go forward, make contact with them, and place them into custody as required. That was the hot stop procedure of the time for the Highway Patrol. So the whole concept of contact and cover is one of those basic fundamental principles that we talk about in policing, right? And so when we have a contact and cover operation, the idea is that the officer who's in the hole, who's in close proximity to the suspects, is unable to keep an eye on the entirety of the scene. And he can't possibly track all of the threats and see all of the things that happen because his attention is so focused on the people that he's dealing with right up close. And so we post an officer from a further distance who can maintain overwatch, maintain fire superiority, take advantage of better cover, and he has better visibility on what's going on. And he can provide a safety net, if you will, for the officer that actually has to go up and make contact with the bad guys. And that only works if our contact officer maintains his position of cover. Rather. If the cover officer leaves his position of cover and he now becomes a second contact officer, now nobody is watching the greater scene. Now everybody is only able to deal with the threats that are immediately in front of them, and they don't have greater situational awareness and greater visibility. And so, unfortunately, when Officer Frago went forward to extract Twining out of the passenger side of the car, that contract, if you will, between the officers of having a contact officer and a cover officer broke down. And tactically, that put both of the officers in greater jeopardy. If Frago had maintained his position of cover, it would have been a safer position for both officers to work from. But unfortunately, he moved forward, and when he did and became a second contact officer, things became a lot more dangerous for both of them. And we can speculate as to why he did that. And that's all we can do is we can speculate because we don't have the officers here to talk to. I would suggest that perhaps part of it was this confusion between whether or not we're going to deal with this as a high threat scenario or a low threat scenario. Again, we've got a relatively common brandishing event. So was it possible that in Officer Frago's mind that this was a low threat event and that it didn't require him to maintain a position of cover to ensure their safety? That's possible. The other part of it is that he was armed with a shotgun. And in the CHP training at the time, there was a lot of emphasis on the spread of a buckshot pattern. And it's very possible that Officer Frago may have thought that if he did fire his shotgun from that distance, that he could endanger his fellow officer because the spread of the buckshot pattern would be so wide. And so it's possible that he may have left his position there because he felt that he was in jeopardy of committing fratricide, if he had to fire from that position. So maybe he felt it was important to move forward to get Officer Gore out of the danger of being wounded by his own shotgun pellets. We don't know. Officer Gore could possibly have even called him forward to ask for assistance because the passenger was not exiting the car as he was directed to. And Frago may have been so concerned about that passenger who wasn't following directions that he felt the best way to deal with it was to move forward and extract him himself because he wasn't listening to Gore's commands. So, there's any number of reasons why he may have left that position, but the tactical reality of it is that when he did leave that position, he now opened both of them up to a close range ambush that followed. And he was unable to fight back in the way that he advanced on that vehicle. If he had stowed the CHP shotgun before he advanced, put it back in the rack, and then gone forward with just his revolver in hand, he would have been able to immediately react to Twining popping the door open and shooting at him. But because both of his hands were tied up in a manner that he couldn't access either of his weapons, he was a sitting duck. And that's
and as we know from
we see.
It's something that we see, and as we know,
we continue to see that.
We continue to see it. And Twining said that he said that the officer, I'm paraphrasing, let his guard down or things like this, put himself at disadvantage. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but he saw an opening and he took it. And again, I keep putting this back on me. I want the audience to understand, and Mike, you are as thoughtful today as you are in the book about, so listen, we don't know. We weren't there. We don't know exactly why the officers did X, Y, and Z. We can sit here on Monday morning quarterback forever, but we were not the ones there. And so when I talk about mistakes being made, I keep looking, self-reflection about, my God, it's like look, you flew planes in the military. And we know that, God forbid, when a large aircraft goes down, there's almost always more than just one reason this happens. It's not just one reason.
Yeah.
And I think about the times where, again, I went home safely when I probably shouldn't have. It's because I wasn't contacting the quote unquote right person to take advantage of my mistakes. So these things have to come together to happen.
So a quick question. Is it fair to say that, because I know when I heard the premise that, that second officer behind the door would be the Overwatch, and I thought, man, not a good idea with a shotgun for the very reasons that you mentioned, Mike. Is it fair to say that tactic was flawed from the beginning? That officer would be covering with a shotgun in a situation like that with buckshot?
I think it's very situational dependent, right? I think it's an appropriate tactic to use for many scenarios, and for some scenarios, perhaps not. I think that the shotgun spread, the pattern that it throws, it was even with the ammunition that the Highway Patrol had at the time, the spread of that shotgun pellet pattern is not as large as the officers were led to believe it was. In common movies and literature and so forth, and even dating back to World War I and the military's experience with using shotguns in combat, there was always an emphasis on them being street sweepers, where they would fire one round and everybody downrange within a 1,000 yard radius would get hit by a pellet, And honestly, the spread of a shotgun pattern is much more controlled than that. And I think it's an appropriate weapon to use. I think it could be safely used, even with officers downrange, if it's properly employed. But the training that these officers received on these shotguns was very minimal. And so this is something that we kind of perhaps could dive into. But in 1964, the Highway Patrol authorized shotguns for their highway patrolmen essentially under protest. They were forced to arm their officers with shotguns. In November of 1963, a highway patrolman was killed by a set of bank robbers up in the Truckee area. And he was killed by shotgun-armed bank robbers. And the local assemblywoman for the district there felt that this officer was at a significant disadvantage because he was armed only with his 6-shot revolver going up against armed bank robbers with heavy weapons. And so she actually introduced legislation into the state legislature that would fund shotguns for the Highway Patrol. And the Highway Patrol didn't want them because at the time, the Highway Patrol felt that it would make their officers look too militaristic. They felt that it was too aggressive of a look, and they were worried about their officers looking paramilitary. And so culturally, the Highway Patrol was resistant to having these guns. And when they finally did get authorized, they didn't authorize them for everybody. They bought a few, and they were out there, but not every vehicle was equipped with them. Not every officer had access to them. They also put policies and procedures in place that discouraged their use. The shotguns would be loaded in a cruiser-ready condition, as we call it, where you have essentially a loaded magazine and an empty chamber. And the shotgun would have a adhesive paper seal that would be applied over the top of the barrel that would wrap around the fore end of the shotgun. And the intent of the seal was to indicate whether or not the shotgun was loaded, because when the action was racked, the paper seal that was attached to the shotgun would break, and it would indicate that somebody had loaded the chamber of the shotgun. And this paper seal, if it was broken by an officer during the course of his duty, could only be replaced by his sergeant. And the officer would have to write a memo explaining why he felt it was necessary to load the shotgun. The sergeant would have to be called out to the field to unload the shotgun, place it back in a cruiser-ready condition, and then apply a new seal and take the memo from the officer, and at the same time probably chew him out for the inconvenience of having to come out there and do all that. And so culturally within the Highway Patrol, there was a lot of, if you will, resistance to using their most potent weapon that they had at their discretion, right, at their availability. The conditions of the insufficient training and the policies and procedures would have discouraged the use of the shotgun by Officer Frago, and that may have been a big part of why he acted the way he did with it that night in approaching the vehicle.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And listen, when I came on the job in the academy in 1990, in the field 1991, I was on patrol with officers that come on in 1966. They were still on the job. And of course, it's only 24, 25 years later. And many of them were still working in Altadena at the time, but had been in Glendale when the Newhall incident happened, and they were very, very familiar with it. But they talked about the seal and the shotgun. And in fact, I was talking to one of these gentlemen yesterday, a very, very good friend of mine. And I was let him know we're going to speak with you. He's very excited because he's read your book as well. He says, excellent guest. And I asked him about that, about the seal and the shotgun. He said, Mark, he said, we carried our own seals with us because there's no way in hell that we were going to be writing a memorandum and begging forgiveness from the sergeant every time that we felt that our safety was in jeopardy. And so they carry their own seals.
Yeah.
They replenished, they unloaded and replenished the shotgun, made it, patrol ready, things like that all the time. But you go into the book in great detail, Mike, about the broader mindset of the Highway Patrol about public image at the time. And before we get into that just a little bit, there's so much to cover. Look, the work that the CHP went through to refine and promote and retain a very positive public image is the reason that the CHP is the only law enforcement agency for which I applied. I said, I'm going to go to the Highway Patrol. It's no place else. So, before it sounds like, we're bagging on the CHP about this. It had a wonderful impact on public perception and the professionalism of its officers. Now, there's no free ride in life. In other words, everything comes at a cost. And sometimes that might be maybe the utmost in officer safety, especially going back decades. I'm not so much now. But one of the things you talk about was the requirement at the time when an officer made a traffic stop, because there was only he's at the time, had to put their hat on as they exit the patrol car. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, we look at that now as utterly arcane and ridiculous when you think about the circumstances under which an officer may have to exit his patrol car in an emergency, a situation like this, and they're trained over and over and over that you have to be in full and complete uniform, including that cap. Back then it was a cap, now it's a campaign hat for rank and file officers. And there's no doubt that these four officers, mindset is one of the things that we talked a little bit about, but that was part of the overall mindset about, I want to make sure I don't get in trouble for being out of uniform if the sergeant rolls up.
Yeah, and that again, it goes back to the culture of the agency at the time, and that is so important, and it's such an influence on the way that people act, and it's hard for people that haven't been perhaps in the law enforcement profession or the military profession to understand just how overriding the culture of an organization can be, and how it can physically alter the way that people act. And, you talked about the image of the Highway Patrol, and they did very much try to foster a public safety, public service image where they wanted the public to be very comfortable in dealing with the Highway Patrol out there. They wanted them to be seen as officer friendly. And so in an effort to encourage that kind of atmosphere and encourage that kind of culture, they did things in training. They did things with respect to policies and procedures and tactics and so forth that would help to try to promote that image. And among those things, the Highway Patrol at the time would have very, very strict uniform policies, as you discussed. You would get days off without pay if you were found outside of your vehicle without your hat in place, or if your tie had been unclipped or something like that. There was a swift penalties for things like that. Additionally, if an officer was making a stop on a vehicle and he had cause for concern and he approached that vehicle with his hand on his holstered revolver, and a citizen complained about that to the agency, he could get days off without pay and be punished for being too aggressive with the public in the way that he approached the vehicle. And so these things culturally, if we take a look at the environment that these young officers were raised in and working in, there were significant penalties for being too aggressive with the public, and that would couch the way that they approached a situation like this as well. Even though there was a brandishing incident involved here and there was a gun involved, we've talked about how it was a relatively common thing for the area, and in the back of their brains, they could always be thinking, man, we got to be careful how we do this because we don't want to get in trouble with the boss if we appear too aggressive in the way that we handle this stop. And unfortunately, they were dealing with two really bad guys, okay? These guys were not just felons that were out there paroled and robbing banks. These were both men that had killed multiple people. Twining had been in and out of federal prisons, 9 different federal prisons, since he was 16 years old. He'd killed at least 2 men that we know about, the latest of which was during a prison stint in the prison laundry. Davis had killed his first man as a young Marine at age 19 and was punished for it in the military. We believe that he killed other people in the course of a career of robbery that he went on after the Marine Corps. He actually went into the Marine Corps as a condition that the judge set to avoid an assault with a deadly weapon charge. And that's how he wound up in the Marine Corps. And he'd been in prison for many, many years, having been paroled just a matter of months before the night of this incident here. So these were 2 hardcore bad people. They were bad to the core, and they were dealing with 4 very young, very inexperienced police officers who were raised in a culture where you can't be harsh with the public, you can't seem to be too aggressive. We don't want you to use the tools that we give you, like the shotgun. And so there were a whole lot of conditions that our officers had to overcome in the process of dealing with these bad guys. But our bad guys had no bars on their behavior at all. They were free to execute their plan, to use as much violence and as much aggression as they wanted to. And so our officers were at a very distinct disadvantage from the mindset and the mental awareness and preparedness standpoint of this whole thing. And this kind of goes back to something that you mentioned, Mark, about how you thought about all the years that you were serving and all the opportunities that people would have had to have hurt you if they had been able to take advantage of your inattention or something like that, or a mistake that you made. And, in the military and particularly in military aviation, we talk about how all of these significant accidents, they're all caused by a chain of events, right? It's never one big mistake that makes an airplane crash. It's a series of small mistakes that compound on each other. And over time, all of these small errors add up to the conditions where you have an airplane crash or you have an accident. And at any point in that chain, if you were to change just one small error that was made, you could interrupt the whole flow and you could circumvent the whole thing from happening. Any small little error that was made along the way, that if it had just been stopped by somebody or just noticed, or if things had gone just slightly different, it could have broken differently. And that's what this event was too. If we take a look at if our first officers on scene had just waited that extra minute and they'd had backup officers show up, then it could have changed. If they had elected not to go forward, if they had elected to direct that Pontiac to move to a position where they had greater advantage, it could have gone differently. If Frago had not left his position of cover, it could have gone differently. If they had been able to get the 1199 call out earlier, it might have gone differently. There's so many different twists and turns as to how this could have gone differently. Any one error that was prevented could have stopped this from turning into a battle where 4 officers were killed. But unfortunately, all the cards and all the dominoes lined up just in the wrong way that night for those 4 young men. And so that's why we talk about these things, and that's why we debrief them in the level that we do, so that we can get officers that are out there today that are doing these types of things to be thinking about these types of issues. And
I think you summed it up very well about really a combination of errors that it takes to have these types of things happen normally. One of the things you hit on there was about if they got me 1199 call out maybe a little sooner. And that reminded me about where we've come with radio communications. And at the time, the patrol cars only communicated directly with dispatch, and then dispatch would relay information to the other units. Of course, now when I came on 34 years ago, you have a car to dispatch and you have car to car. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, looking back, if that would have made a difference. Possibly, I'm not sure. But the point is about equipment. And it's one thing we haven't you know, really hit on too much. One of the aspects you talked about earlier, Mike, was the leather pouch, carrying the 6 rounds of 38 caliber bullets, and how incredibly difficult that must have been at the time for an officer under that level of duress, which no one here on this podcast, and I would imagine most people in the audience can't even imagine being under. But having to pick those bullets up individually and get them into the individual cylinders, it just beyond my imagination. One of the things that resulted were speed loaders that came very soon after that. By the way, speed loaders had been around for a few years, a handful of years before that, but weren't popularized for any number of reasons we can talk about. But that's one of the things that the CHP brought on board relatively quickly after Newhall. Is that correct?
That's correct. They by about 1972 or so, the speed loaders were starting to be authorized, and also shortly thereafter were issued for officers on the patrol. Prior to that, they were required to use the dump pouch, but the speed loaders came as a reaction to that. And that brings up something interesting too. If we take a look at the hierarchy of things that guarantee our survival, and this is something that I talk about in the book, the most important thing that an officer can enter into a fight with is the proper mindset and awareness and mental preparation for dealing with the issues. The next most important thing he can have is a robust set of tactics that he is well versed in and is able to properly use. The next most important thing that he would have is his skill at arms, his ability to use his equipment efficiently to put rounds on target. And the very last priority is the equipment, And honestly, in the big scheme of things, it really it doesn't really matter, what kind of pistol you have in your holster, as long as you're capable of using it efficiently and you're using the proper tactics that might prevent you from having to use it at all. And you have the proper mindset and awareness that might allow you to avoid the fight entirely because you stage things to your advantage so that the bad guy never wants to take you on. And so, but when we look at the way that organizations react to critical incidents like this, they usually get the priorities backwards. So we see the equipment changes are usually the first and easiest thing that happen in response to something like this, right? Something goes bad. Well, we're going to go buy new gear for our people. And that's part of the problem, and that's definitely something that needs to be fixed in many cases, but that's the easy button, right? That's the low-hanging fruit where we just cut a check and we buy some new stuff. But it's a lot harder for you to change the training process that has your people prepared to use that gear efficiently and to use better tactics and so forth. And the most difficult thing of all is to change that agency culture that we talked about, right? Which influences the mindset of your officers and their mental preparation. So the CHP went down this same path like every large bureaucracy does, where in the immediate aftermath, they were focused on equipment changes. And so they purchased things, they authorized things, they made changes to equipment, and that was the easy stuff. The harder things were the things that took a generation to fix for the highway patrol, right? To change the training, to change the tactics, to change the agency mindset so that an officer safety culture predominated in the highway patrol rather than a culture where officers were, expected to be ideal model public servants that would never have a cross word and would never act aggressively with the public, even when it was necessary to defend innocent life. And so those types of things were generational changes that it took the highway patrol much longer to deal with. But we saw equipment changes in the short term. We saw some tactics changes. The way that the hot stop procedures developed into what we now call felony stop procedures, that was all the direct derivative of the Newhall experience. The highway patrol had tactics, but those tactics were refined and perfected after Newhall so that they had more robust and more reliable and better tactics to use in this type of situation.
Bill, I'm curious, from your point of view, being in federal law enforcement for 3 decades, Did you have any? Were you a witness to any evolution as far as um, mindset and as far as survivability, or during that time?
I would say it was more tactics.
Hmm.
There was a big transition when I started, Mark, just around the same time you did. There was a big transition from what I call the cowboy 80s to the very structured 90s. Like it wasn't uncommon when we did a search warrant in 1992. There would be a guy with a 6-shot 2-inch revolver with penny loafers on and a vest that was ill fitting and, you know, likely a lit cigarette in his mouth, in all honesty, right? And he would be in front of someone with body armor, with a plate, with a 9 millimeter subgun and a helmet. And that was just whatever generation you were from. And it was a painful transition in some cases where the older generation didn't want to hear about the tactics and safety. And as Mike said, it was a cultural thing.
Hmm.
The agency took pride in being the cowboys and just running and gunning. And it took some time for that kind of uncomfortable mesh to finally take place where people realize, no, this is about officer safety, and this is the way things are going to have to be. One thing that I thought was interesting is I saw like an after action that the sheriff's department did where they had paid actors, and it was when Pitchess was sheriff. And what I found interesting is even those tactics were at least one generation behind what we do today. They did a felony stop, but they called the people back to them facing them. And then they walked that person up to the car to check for other subjects and said, you're going to get it first if there's anyone else in the car. Things that would never even be considered today. So it was interesting to see at that time, even when they thought this is the best tactic, it was still so far from what you would see today in a felony car stop. And that's just the evolution of learning.
Well, Bill, I find that very, very powerful because it's actually kind of coming from the other end of the spectrum, where we're with the DEA and your federal law enforcement experience. We're talking about bravado and the cowboy
Mm-hmm.
mentality. The other end of the spectrum, this high end patrol, is, hey, we are absolutely untouchable as far as reputation. We're not going to exhibit any overt aggression or unnecessary aggression. We don't want to give the impression that we are here for anything but pure service to the public, that we are beyond reproach. We're not going to make any mistakes here about making assumptions about your criminality, things like this. But both of these, Mike, as you said, and you did too, Bill, that it's the culture. Whatever the culture is, it's extremely powerful. And once those cultures are embedded, they're very, very difficult
Yeah.
to change. Even when we look back with hindsight and say, you know what, it was the right thing to change. Very, very difficult.
Mark, an
Um,
example real quick. One
yes.
of the first operations I was on, 1992, a parking lot buy bus scenario.
Hmm.
One of those older, more experienced officers with the 2-inch runs up and puts his hands in the driver's window to take physical control of the driver with the 2-inch in his hand and starts trying to pull him out the passenger window. The gun goes off. Everyone freezes. No one moves, and all of a sudden there's compliance and the guy gets out.
I bet there
And
was. Yeah.
yeah, when we
Yeah.
got him back to the office and we're taking off, it was a leather jacket he was wearing. When we took it off to handcuff him, we heard this. And the lead fell to the ground and hit the ground.
Hmm.
So, that
Jeez.
close, that
Yeah.
close. But again, no one talked about it. Like that was just, hey, why are you guys waiting? Go. And it was
Yeah.
just pull them through the window with the gun in your hand. And there were so many times that I saw suspects contacted by people holding a gun. And you think, man, that's the opposite end of the spectrum, like you said.
It is, and it all comes down to culture. And again, how culture gets to be culture, that's the subject for another 5 podcasts. But the point is, it's a very, very powerful element that all of us in law enforcement, formerly in law enforcement, deal with. There are two things, and we're winding down time here, gentlemen. But there are a couple of things really relating to this, and we'll get to that last, about where we are now, Mike. And kind of, are we seeing history repeat itself? I want to finish with that before, related to to survivability. The gentleman who does your forward, and forgive me the pronunciation, Masab Ayub, is
Yes.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Legendary.
Legendary. And if you haven't read his stuff, please read it. But I think he's the one that talks about priorities of survival in the book. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, that's the model that I discuss.
Yes, that's the model, and I'm glad you brought it up. I have so many notes here that I made before, and then you're talking, oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, I want to talk about that. We just don't have enough time for it. And that's why people have to read your book. They have to read this book if they want to learn about how we got to where we are and lessons learned from the Newhall incident. But it's so logical, and of course, the most brilliant things are simple. That's the thing. The most brilliant things are simple when you look back. Oh my God, how come I didn't think about that? And Mossad puts it in very simple terms. I mean, they're very succinct. That really a chapter, I believe it is, but it's very straightforward. I believe he uses the fighter pilot scenario, if I remember correctly, in talking about survival and things like this. But it's, and I brought up the speed loader, so you made it clear that this is the itch that agencies want to scratch. Okay, what new weapon do we buy? And we can talk about that. Look, I was the first class of CHP cadets who was armed with the Smith & Wesson 40 caliber 4006 model semi-automatic. I was the first. My seniors in the academy had the old wheel guns, revolvers, and here he had the semi-automatic weapon. Great weapon. I still own it. Great weapon. But again, tactics and mindset training, they're far, far more important than what weapon you have. And it's something I just think that anybody listening to this in law enforcement, if you are in a position to train people, to educate people, let's start with the best weapon you have, which is right here that God gave you, your mind. Do the training, prepare yourself mentally, envision yourself being in these situations. Whatever training can raise your heart rate, to get your blood pressure up, to put you in those stressful situations, do it as often as possible. You don't want that first real punch coming, on the side of the freeway or in a front door. You want that coming from somebody you know. That's going to get you a little bit acclimated. So I just want to throw that out there. But I want to finish with this, Mike, about where we are now. And are we, in other words, has the pendulum swung back a little bit now the wrong direction? I think from everybody here's point of view, the wrong direction. Are we setting ourselves up now for lack of a better comparison, another Newhall? Matter of fact, the last several years, we've seen similar situations across the country, but are we setting ourselves up now where we're putting law enforcement needlessly on the defensive? I want to get your take on that. Look, there's something called below 100. And below 100 is, again, I hate to say it, it's almost passé now. Below 100 was an effort to keep the number of officers across the nation that die in the line of duty under 100. That was the effort. It's been around for quite some time. That was the effort. But what we've seen now in the last several years, 130, 140, 150 every year. In other words, it's so far beyond the 100 killed, it's almost like we've lost control. I want to get your take about why you think that is, where we're going from now, and what can be done to fix it.
Bill, did you want to start off, or did you want me to chime in? So we talked earlier at length about the importance of culture, and I think that we are back in a situation right now where we have a very, very bad culture for our law enforcement officers in America. Our officers are under attack from all corners. They're frequently not supported by their public. They're not supported by the legal system. They're not supported by even their own chiefs and sheriffs. And our officers are in a very, very difficult position here in the United States, and more so in certain areas than others, right? When we have some more rural areas, oftentimes our officers wind up getting much better support. Certain states, their officers get much better support, but there are many major urban areas and many states throughout our nation where our officers are in a very difficult position, and they are being discouraged in many, many ways from actively doing their job. And they feel that if they do their job, that they might be subject to persecution or prosecution. And so we have a very, very negative culture for law enforcement in many parts of America right now. And it's a dangerous thing for us. We are creating the conditions where officers are going to make mistakes, tactical mistakes that could cost them their lives because they are intimidated from using an appropriate level of force early in a confrontation with a suspect. And you guys know as well as I that there are times when a certain level of force early in a confrontation can stop you from using more aggressive force later in a confrontation. You can head off a problem early. And so we're in a very, very tough spot right now. The assaults on our officers are reaching statistical highs again that we haven't seen in a long time. The FBI puts out their law enforcement officers killed and assaulted report every year that summarizes the attacks on law enforcement. The latest summary in preparation for the release of the full 2023 report indicates that we're seeing more assaults on law enforcement officers in the last 3-year period than we've seen over the last 20. We also have had more officers killed in the last 3-year period than at any other time in the last 10-year period. I'll read a quote from it. Between 2021 and 23, the years that are looked at in the special report, we had more officers killed, 194 total, than in any other consecutive 3-year period in the last 20 years. So, and then as far as attacks on officers, we had 79,091 assaults on officers in 2023, making it the highest officer assault rate in the past 10 years. So our officers are under great duress right now at the same time that they are feeling less and less support from the public and the system that asks them to go out there and enforce the law. And so I'm afraid that we're creating a culture where incidents like this Newhall incident are much more likely to happen. And that's something that we as Americans need to fix. You know, if we are going to be a nation of laws and we are going to ask our fellow citizens who wear a badge and a uniform to go out and enforce those laws on our behalf, then we have to give them the support that they deserve for that mission. And right now they're not being supported, and they are being targeted for doing their job. And it's a very, very difficult and unwinnable position for them to be in. And so that's something that we culturally as Americans need to fix for the better.
Mike Wood, just a pleasure. That's all I can say. I'm going to put this up. Ladies and gentlemen, screenshot it right there. That is the book, Newhall Shooting, a Tactical Analysis. There's so much that Mike just summarized there in the last 2 or 3 minutes that he goes into great detail about in this book. You have to read it if you believe in and support the rule of law. There is no rule without the rule keepers. And those are the men and women in uniform that risk it all to protect you and me and all of our families. Mike Wood, thank you so much for the insight. Thank you for the pleasure of I've had reading this book. As tragic as it is, I learned a tremendous amount. Bill Bodner, as always, thank you so much. As I said at the beginning of this episode, make sure you go back and watch episode 1 to get a foundation for what we're talking about today. You have to do it. God bless all of you. God bless our men and women in law enforcement and in uniform out there. And we'll see you next time on Your Leo Nation.